Close your eyes for a moment. Can you hear it? The crackle of a vinyl Christmas record, the jingle of a cash register at Woolworths, and the laughter spilling out of a snow-dusted Main Street in 1950s America. Back then, through the glowing 60s and into the cozy 70s, Christmas wasn't about rushing or scrolling. It was about peppermint cocoa, twinkling window displays, and families huddled together under the warm glow of a tree that felt like the very heart of home. If you were young in the 1950s, Christmas and New Year's weren't just dates marked in red on a calendar. They were the very heartbeat of winter, the high point of the year when the ordinary world seemed to shimmer with magic. Looking back, it feels as though the whole decade glowed brighter in December. It was a time of snow-capped neighborhoods, laughter carried on frosty air, and homes transformed into lanterns of warmth against the long nights. To remember, it is to step into a world that felt safe, simple, and filled with wonder. A world where Christmas was not an event you attended, but an atmosphere you lived inside of. The streets themselves changed with the season. The first snowfall, when it finally came, was more than weather. It was the signal that the festivities had begun. A blanket of white lay across front lawns. Every picket fence wore a cap of snow, and the lampposts became halos of golden light. Children rushed outside as soon as the flakes stuck, their wool mittens soaked within minutes, sleds dragged behind them like banners of excitement. We built snowmen tall enough to rival the mailboxes, their carrot noses often stolen from the kitchen without permission, their scarves borrowed from the hall closet. We lay down in yards to make snow angels, arms sweeping, breath puffing upward in frosty clouds. The world was quiet under the snow, but also alive, the crunch under boots echoing like music of its own. Downtown, the department stores performed their own transformation. In cities and even small towns, shop windows became miniature worlds. You could stand in front of a Macy's or a local Five and Dime and be transported. A toy train circled a cardboard mountain, dolls twirled under painted snowflakes, and a mechanical Santa waved as if he recognized you personally. Families made outings just to admire the displays, noses pressed against cold glass, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. The magic wasn't only inside the stores, it was right there on the sidewalks, free for everyone to share. Inside the house, transformation came in a rush of pine scent. Families bought real trees, hauled home, strapped to the roof of a Chevy or Ford, or carried from a neighborhood lot where men in flannel coats sold spruces and firs for a few dollars apiece. You could smell the tree before you even unwrapped your scarf. The needles pricked your fingers as you carried it in, leaving a trail on the carpet that no amount of sweeping could fully erase until spring. Decorating was a ritual. Heavy glass ornaments, often passed down from grandparents, reflected the firelight. The newer bubble lights fascinated us, little tubes of colored liquid that danced with shimmering bubbles once warmed, like tiny science experiments strung on branches. Tinsel was draped strand by strand, though the kids tended to toss it in clumps, and the parents would rearrange it later. At the very top went a star or an angel, sometimes homemade from cardboard and aluminum foil, sometimes ordered from the Sears catalog, shining proudly as the crowning jewel. Once the tree was lit, the room itself transformed. You could switch off every other lamp, sit cross-legged on the rug in your pajamas, and watch the colored bulbs twinkle. The tree was alive casting shadows that turned walls into murals, reflecting on shiny floors and polished ornaments. The house smelled of pine, cookies, and the faint tang of pipe tobacco, a mix that today still brings back the season instantly. Music carried the magic even further. The radio was a heart of the home long before stereos and hi-fis took over. Bing Crosby's White Christmas poured out year after year, so familiar it felt eternal. Perry Como's calm voice, Nat King Cole's velvet smoothness, and later Elvis with his touch of rock and roll, they all became part of the soundtrack. You didn't just listen. You absorbed the songs until they became stitched into the fabric of December itself. Families would gather in the living room, children lying on the carpet, parents sipping coffee or cocoa, the radio glowing with its dials like a beacon in the corner. Evenings were filled with carols, laughter, and sometimes sing-alongs, the voices uneven, but the joy undeniable. Food was its own celebration. Kitchens bustled with activity weeks before the big day. Fruit cakes were baked early, wrapped in wax paper, and tucked away to ripen. Sugar cookies were rolled out on flowered counters, cut into bells, stars, and reindeer, decorated with sprinkles of red and green sugar. Mothers pulled trays from the oven, and the children hovered nearby, waiting for the chance to sneak a still warm cookie, burning their tongues, but grinning through it. Candy canes were hooked on the tree, but they never lasted long. Little hands would pull one off each night till the branches were bare. The refrigerator, with its rounded chrome handle, held bowls of Jell-O salads that shimmered like stained glass, whipped cream topped with cherries, and pies stacked in preparation. Christmas dinner itself was a marvel. A golden turkey or glazed ham, mountains of mashed potatoes, stuffing that smelled of sage, green bean casserole crowned with crunchy onions, and rolls warm from the oven. The table was crowded not just with food, but with people, grandparents, cousins, neighbors who stopped by. The dining room rang with conversation, stories, and the clinking of silverware. The anticipation of Christmas Eve was almost unbearable for children. For many families, it meant a trip to church, bundled into coats and scarves, filing into candlelit pews where choirs sang "O Holy Night" and "Silent Night," with voices that rose like prayers themselves. The stained glass glowed from the inside, and the whole building smelled of pine wreaths and candle wax. Back at home, cookies and milk were set out for Santa, sometimes accompanied by a handwritten note in shaky pencil. "Thank you for coming. Please don't forget our house." Stockings, often actual wool socks in those early years, were hung by the mantel or tacked onto the wall. Bedtime was impossible. Children tossed under heavy quilts, whispering with siblings, ears straining for reindeer hooves on a roof, hearts pounding at every creak of the floorboards. Morning came in an explosion of joy. No alarm clock ever had the power of Christmas dawn. Children barreled downstairs, sometimes long before parents were ready, sometimes forced to wait until coffee was poured. Stockings were the first treasures: oranges, peppermint sticks, peanuts in the shell, a toy car or yo-yo tucked inside. Then came the gifts under the tree, each one wrapped in bright paper, saved from the Sears or Montgomery Ward catalogs, ribboned and tagged in neat handwriting. Presents weren't extravagant by modern standards, but to us they were priceless. A Lionel train set clicking around the tree, its whistle sharp and bright. A brand new sled painted red, ready for the hill. a doll with eyes that opened and closed, Mr. Potato Head, still using real potatoes before plastic heads became standard, a hula hoop in its bright box, promising hours of laughter once spring arrived, board games, erector sets, teddy bears, all greeted with gasps of joy. Parents sat with warm mugs of coffee, smiling at the chaos, the paper flying, the shrieks of happiness. But the season wasn't only about gifts. It was about the people and the rhythm of community life. Neighbors knew one another, and the holidays brought visits across fences and porches. Plates of cookies were exchanged, small gifts of fudge or fruitcake delivered with a knock on the door. Carolers came in groups, their breath visible in the frosty air, their voices lifting into the night with "Deck the Halls" and "Joy to the World." Even the postman and the milkman were remembered with small envelopes tucked into their hands, tokens of gratitude that spoke of a slower, more personal world. Children's lives in the 1950s carried their own holiday traditions. Schools held Christmas pageants where nervous kids in paper crowns sang "We Three Kings," and classrooms exchanged handmade cards trimmed with glitter that never quite stuck. Holiday parties meant paper cups of punch, cookies on napkins, and the thrill of leaving school for vacation. Outside, the neighborhood was an endless playground. Children bundled in snowsuits raced sleds down hills, played crack the whip on frozen ponds, or built forts from piled snowbanks. When cheeks were red and mittens stiff with ice, they clattered back inside to warm up with hot cocoa, marshmallows floating, faces pressed to frosted windows to watch the snow still falling. For many families, Christmas meant travel, often by train. The railroads were lifelines of the decade, gleaming engines pulling families across states to visit grandparents and cousins. You remember the sound of the whistle in the cold night, the hiss of steam, the clatter of tracks beneath the wheels. Inside the cars, windows frosted from the breath of passengers. Children pressed faces to glass, hoping to catch a glimpse of snowy farms and twinkling towns along the way. Conductors in crisp uniforms punched tickets, and the dining car was a wonder, with white tablecloths and hot chocolate served in china cups. For a child, a holiday trip by train was not just travel, it was adventure wrapped in romance. The holiday season lived not only in memory, but also in magazines and catalogs. The Sears Wish Book was a Bible of dreams. Children flipped through its pages until they wore thin, circling toys with pencils, making lists far longer than any parent could fulfill. Lionel trains, dolls with wardrobes, toy soldiers, chemistry sets, all lay before your eyes like treasures in a vault. Life magazine arrived with glossy spreads of Rockefeller Center's Christmas tree, department store parades, and advertisements that made everything look larger than life. Coca-Cola's Santa, with his rosy cheeks and twinkling eyes, seemed as real as any living man, smiling from billboards, reminding you that even a bottle of soda could be festive. Television joined the celebration as the decade progressed. Early in the 50s, most sets were black and white, big consoles that were furniture as much as machines. Families gathered around for Christmas variety shows, Perry Como, Ed Sullivan, or local broadcasts featuring choirs and orchestras. By the late 50s, some households were lucky enough to have a color set, and seeing a Christmas parade or holiday program in bright reds and greens felt like a glimpse into the future itself. Children sprawled on shag rugs, parents on sofas, popcorn bowls passed around, everyone laughing and gasping together. It wasn't just entertainment. It was togetherness, a shared glow that made the season shine brighter. And then there was New Year's Eve, less commercial, but no less cherished. Adults gathered at home parties, pouring highballs into cut-glass tumblers, clinking champagne flutes at midnight. The music was Sinatra or Guy Lombardo's orchestra on television, ushering in the new year with Auld Lang Syne. Children were sometimes allowed to stay up, eyelids heavy, trying to make it to midnight. Outside, horns blared, firecrackers popped, and neighbors shouted greetings into the cold night. It was a moment of shared hope, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. To a child, it felt like stepping into the wide unknown with a clean slate, the whole year waiting like unwrapped presents. Looking back now, the memories aren't about the prices, though a tree might cost a few dollars and a toy train set 20 or 30. They aren't about the exact gifts or meals. What remains is the feeling, the smell of pine and cookies, the crackle of firewood, the laughter of cousins in crowded houses, the glow of lights against frosty windows. It was a world where neighbors were friends, where the community was family, where safety and hope seemed as common as snow in December. The 1950s gave us holidays filled with optimism, simplicity, and connection. They gave us the joy of anticipation, the magic of discovery, and the comfort of tradition. Even today, when the world feels faster and noisier, those memories remain untouched, shining like ornaments carefully stored in the attic of the heart. They remind us that once, in a decade of post-war promise, Christmas and New Year's were more than holidays. They were experiences of wonder, lived fully, remembered forever. They were the times when the whole world seemed wrapped in ribbon, glowing in colored lights, humming with carols, a season of joy that never truly ends. If the first thing you remember about Christmas in the 1950s is the glow of the tree in the living room, the second is the way the whole community seemed to come alive. Holidays weren't just celebrated within the four walls of your home, they spilled out into town squares, main streets, and neighborhood halls. Every December, America itself seemed to put on a festive coat. Churches, schools, scout groups, and even the smallest corner shops turned themselves into theaters of joy, each contributing to a season that felt both local and universal. The Christmas parade was the crown jewel of many towns. If you lived near a city, you might have seen the grand Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade on television, the balloons drifting high above New York's avenues, kicking off the season with a flourish. But even in small towns, parades were spectacles. Marching bands in bright uniforms filled the air with carols, drum majors twirling batons with icy breath trailing behind them. Children lined the curbs wrapped in scarves, stomping their feet to keep warm, waiting for Santa's sleigh to appear at the very end. Sometimes he rode on a real horse-drawn wagon, other times in the back of a shiny red fire truck, waving as if he knew every child by name. The parades weren't polished affairs. Floats were built from chicken wire, crepe paper, and ingenuity. But to our eyes, they were magnificent, and to see your neighbor dressed as a shepherd or angel waving from a float made the magic feel even closer. Shopping was its own adventure. Before malls became the standard, downtown streets glowed with shop windows decked in wreaths, bells, and painted snowflakes. Five and dime stores like Woolworth's or Kresge's stacked shelves with toys, candy, and decorations. The air inside smelled of roasted nuts, pine, and the faint scent of new plastic from freshly unboxed toys. Department stores offered something grander, towering Christmas trees in their lobbies, Santa's throne surrounded by elves, and long lines of children clutching wish lists written on notebook paper. Mothers wore their good coats and gloves, fathers carried parcels tied with string, and children gazed wide-eyed at displays that seemed endless. Shopping wasn't just a task. It was a holiday ritual. You saw neighbors you hadn't seen in months, exchanged greetings with strangers, and felt that the whole town was moving together in the same joyful rhythm. The Sears Wish Book remained the holy grail for children, its pages worn soft from weeks of dreaming. But the catalog wasn't alone. Montgomery Ward, Spiegel, and the toy sections of Life and Look magazines fanned our imaginations. Advertisements were cheerful, colorful promises, shiny red Schwinn bicycles with ribbons on the handlebars, gleaming erector sets that promised the engineering of skyscrapers, chemistry kits that would turn the kitchen into a laboratory. Tonka trucks, sturdy and made of real steel, were shown hauling mountains of sand or snow. Cowboy hats, holsters, and cap guns reflected the nation's love of westerns, and countless boys dreamed of being Roy Rogers or Hopalong Cassidy. Girls pored over dolls with wardrobes that rivaled their mothers, Raggedy Ann with her stitched smile, or Betsy Wetsy that could drink and cry like a real baby. Toward the end of the decade, Matchbox cars began to appear, tiny treasures that fit perfectly in a child's palm. Each ad was more than an offer to buy. It was a window into a perfect holiday morning. And then there were the Christmas cards. Sending and receiving them was an art in itself. Families sat at dining tables in early December with stacks of cards, boxes of envelopes, and lists of names that stretched across states. Parents wrote warm messages in fountain pen ink, sometimes enclosing photographs or handwritten letters. Children helped by licking envelopes and applying stamps. Mailmen carried sacks heavy with greetings, and each day brought new arrivals to the mailbox. Cards were taped to door frames, strung along mantelpieces, or arranged in baskets. Each one was a connection, a reminder that even distant relatives and old friends were part of your season. The ritual of checking the mailbox in December carried a thrill that rivaled any package. School itself transformed in December. Classrooms were decorated with chains of red and green construction paper, snowflakes cut from folded notebook pages, and chalkboard drawings of Santas and snowmen. The annual Christmas pageant was an event. Children donned bathrobes and crowns to play shepherds and kings, or flapped awkwardly as angels with wings made of cardboard and tinsel. Mothers stitched costumes from scraps of fabric, and fathers balanced on ladders hanging stars above makeshift stables. The audience, parents, grandparents, and neighbors, clapped at every line, no matter how mumbled or forgotten. Choirs filled auditoriums with "Hark! The herald angels sing," their young voices rising with sincerity that could melt the iciest heart. Class parties meant cookies, punch, and small gift exchanges, and walking out of school for the holiday break was a feeling as sweet as freedom itself. Outside, winter belonged to children. With no smartphones to hold us indoors, the snowy world was our kingdom. Sledding hills became highways of joy, with wooden sleds racing side by side, the metal runners sparking if they scraped the pavement. Ice skates clattered against frozen ponds, boys playing hockey with makeshift sticks, girls twirling in circles with scarves flying. Snowball fights erupted as if by instinct, armies forming behind forts built from snow piled high. Laughter carried down the streets as dogs chased sleds and younger siblings tried to keep up. By evening, mittens were soaked, boots crusted with ice, and cheeks glowing like apples. Coming inside was its own reward. Socks steaming by radiators, hot chocolate topped with marshmallows, and mothers scolding cheerfully while laying out dry clothes. Not every journey at Christmas was a walk to school or a sled ride down the hill. Many families traveled to see relatives, and in the 1950s, that often meant long car rides. Station wagons were the workhorses of the decade, their rear windows fogged with breath, children piled in the back without seatbelts, blankets shared, songs sung in rounds. Parents packed thermoses of coffee, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and jars of cocoa for the kids. Roads stretched across snowy fields, dotted with billboards wishing Merry Christmas in glowing neon. Gas stations offered attendants in Santa hats, wiping windshields with a smile. Stopping at roadside diners was part of the ritual. Jukeboxes playing carols, waitresses serving pie with whipped cream, paper wreaths taped to the windows. The journey itself was part of the holiday, the car humming through the night while children dozed, dreaming of cousins and presents waiting at the other end. For some, travel meant trains, their whistles echoing across the frozen countryside. Union stations in cities dressed themselves in wreaths and lights, passengers clutching parcels, soldiers on leave reuniting with families. The dining car smelled of turkey and coffee, the windows frosted with a breath of travelers. Conductors tipped their hats to children, handing out cardboard tickets like treasures. Air travel, still new and glamorous, carried its own sense of holiday magic. Airports were small but alive with decorations, and boarding a plane to visit distant relatives was an adventure in itself. The stewardesses smiling in crisp uniforms as though Christmas had taken flight. Entertainment was everywhere. Movie theaters became holiday palaces, marquees glowing against snowy streets. Families lined up in coats and hats, clutching bags of popcorn to see Disney classics reissued or new hits like Lady and the Tramp, 1955, or Sleeping Beauty, 1959. Matinees during Christmas break were packed with children, the theaters warm and filled with laughter. Holiday-themed shorts and cartoons played before the main features, and nothing beat the thrill of watching them with friends. Your boots drying under your seat. Drive-ins, too, tried to capture the season, some staying open in winter, cars packed with blankets, heaters humming as families watched double features under frosty skies. At home, technology added new dimensions to memory-making. By the mid-1950s, Polaroid cameras captured Christmas mornings instantly, photographs developing in minutes to be passed around the breakfast table. Fathers threaded reels into projectors, showing home movies of last year's holiday, flickering images on living room walls of children unwrapping presents or sledding in the yard. The whir of the projector, the laughter as scenes played, the shadows of family on the screen, all became part of the season's ritual. Photographs filled albums, Christmas letters were tucked inside them, and the family archive grew with every holiday. And then the advertising. If you lived through it, you remember. Coca-Cola's Santa grinned from magazine pages and roadside signs, clutching a glass bottle with the same cheer as if it were mulled cider. General Electric promised safe, brilliant holiday lights that would never go out. Campbell's Soup ran ads with mothers ladling steaming bowls to children in snow-dusted coats, their smiles as warm as the soup itself. Automakers filled pages with shiny cars tied in bows, suggesting that a brand-new Chevrolet might just be the ultimate gift. The ads weren't cynical. They were aspirational, glowing with optimism, promising that the American home was the happiest place on earth, especially at Christmas. Christmas crafts and homemade touches filled the gaps where stores couldn't reach. Popcorn garlands were strung on trees, sticky fingers working needle and thread. Cranberries were added for color, beads of red against the white popcorn. Children made ornaments from pipe cleaners, felt, and glitter, bringing them home from school with pride. Gingerbread houses, though simpler than today's elaborate versions, sat on tables, dusted with powdered sugar. Snow mothers embroidered stockings, fathers carved toys or doll furniture, and neighbors exchanged jams, canned peaches, or jars of honey. The personal touch mattered as much as the store-bought gift, and it was these handmade things that often carried the deepest meaning. New Year's Day itself was no afterthought. It began with parades on television, the Rose Parade in Pasadena glowing in black and white, or, for the lucky few, in dazzling color by the late 1950s. Floats rolled by covered in flowers, marching bands played, and announcers spoke in voices filled with excitement. Families gathered around the TV, breakfast casseroles and cinnamon rolls on the table to watch the spectacle before turning to football games in the afternoon. College bowl games filled living rooms with cheers, fathers leaning forward in their chairs, mothers bringing in trays of snacks. The day was leisurely, but filled with tradition, marking a hopeful start to the year. Even the smallest details shimmer in memory. The smell of coal furnaces warming houses, the clatter of typewriters as Christmas letters were finished, the sound of sleigh bells hung on front doors jingling every time someone came in from the cold, the feel of stiff new Levi's worn on Christmas morning, or the tickle of wool socks pulled up before stepping outside, the sound of mail slots clattering with cards, the hum of neon signs declaring Merry Christmas above diners, the low rumble of Studebakers and Buicks idling on snowy streets. Each detail stitched together into a tapestry that defined an era. In the cities, skyscrapers wore wreaths the size of cars, and Rockefeller Center's ice rink sparkled beneath the towering Christmas tree. Department stores like Marshall Field's in Chicago or Wanamaker's in Philadelphia became destinations, their atriums filled with choirs, their restaurants offering special holiday menus. In small towns, theaters held Christmas revues, high school bands performed concerts, and church bells rang across frozen fields. On farms, barns were decorated with simple wreaths. Families exchanged gifts of preserved fruits and baked bread, and sleigh rides behind horses clopping through the snow gave children a sense that they were living in a Currier and Ives print. Looking back now, it's not just nostalgia, it's gratitude. The 1950s gave us holidays that were not perfect, but they felt whole. They were about family, about community, about the belief that tomorrow would be brighter. The decorations might have been simple, the toys less complicated, the travel slower, but the season glowed with a kind of warmth that has never faded. It was a time when neighbors were friends, when children played until the street lights came on, when letters in the mailbox carried the love of those far away, and when the sight of a tree glowing in a frosted window could make an entire block feel enchanted. The memories linger like the final notes of a carol, soft but unshakable. They remind us that the spirit of Christmas and New Year's in the 1950s was more than tradition. It was a way of life, a collective heartbeat that pulsed through every street, every school, every living room. It was joy made visible, optimism you could taste in every cookie, and love that glowed as steady as the lights in the tree. And though the world has changed, that glow remains, evergreen, shining on in memory. If you ever want to understand what hope felt like in the 20th century, all you have to do is remember a December in America during the 1960s. I still can. I can close my eyes and almost smell the pine needles on the living room floor, hear the faint crackle of the record player spinning a Christmas album, and see the glow of colored lights reflecting in frosted windows. Back then, the holidays weren't just a season. They were a state of mind. They wrapped around you like a warm wool blanket, softening the edges of winter and making the whole world feel gentler, brighter, and full of possibility. I remember how the air itself seemed to change sometime around the first week of December. It wasn't just colder. It was sharper, cleaner, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the promise of snow. Neighborhood streets I'd walked down 100 times suddenly looked different, almost enchanted. Garlands hung from the telephone poles, wreaths appeared on every front door, and strings of big old-fashioned bulbs, the kind that hummed gently and glowed like tiny suns, outlined rooftops in brilliant reds, greens, and blues. Every house seemed to be trying to outshine the next, not in competition, but in shared celebration. It was as if we were all saying, "We made it through another year. Let's make this one end beautifully." By the time the first snowflakes fell, and they almost always did before Christmas, the excitement was unstoppable. I remember kids in our neighborhood bolting from classrooms with mittens already half on, sleds clattering behind them, cheeks flushed with anticipation. We'd stay outside until our toes went numb, building snowmen with crooked grins and button eyes, staging snowball battles that lasted until dinner, or lying in the quiet after a storm to carve out angels in the powdery drifts. The cold didn't bother us then. We were fueled by something stronger, the growing hum of the holiday spirit that seemed to pulse through every street light and front porch. Downtown felt like another planet entirely. The department stores, Sears, J.C. Penney, Woolworths, transformed into glittering wonderlands. Their windows became storybooks come to life. Toy trains circling miniature villages, mechanical elves hammering tiny wooden toys, Santa waving as if he'd been waiting just for you. My parents would take us window shopping, even if we couldn't buy much, because that was part of the tradition. Bundled up in scarves and boots, noses pressed against the glass, our reflections merging with scenes of pure holiday fantasy. And inside, the stores smelled like cinnamon and fresh pine, with carols playing over tinny speakers. The escalators were packed with families carrying armfuls of wrapped gifts, children clutching candy canes given out by smiling clerks. But a real magic always started at home. I still remember the ritual of picking out the Christmas tree. We didn't have fancy tree farms or pre-lit artificials then. We'd drive out to a small roadside lot, rows of firs and spruces propped up under strings of bare light bulbs. My father would test each one, shaking the branches, checking the shape, making sure it would stand tall and proud in our living room. Once we found the tree, we'd tie it to the roof of our Chevy and drive home slowly, as if the cargo were too precious to rush. By the time we dragged it through the front door, the scent of pine filled the entire house, richer and more vivid than any candle could ever capture. Decorating the tree was its own sacred ceremony. It wasn't done all at once. It unfolded like a story, one ornament at a time. Some of those ornaments were older than I was, passed down from my grandparents. Heavy glass globes that caught the firelight, hand-painted wooden soldiers, and one delicate star made of tin foil and cardboard that my mother swore she'd made in grade school. We had the classic bubble lights, too, little glass tubes that gurgled and shimmered once they warmed up, fascinating us kids for hours. And, of course, there was the tinsel, always a point of debate. My siblings and I would toss handfuls at the tree, laughing as they clumped in uneven clusters, while my mother patiently rearranged them into neat, glistening strands. When the final ornament was hung and the star placed at the top, we'd switch off every light in the room except for the tree, then sit on the floor and just watch. It wasn't just a decoration. It was the heartbeat of the house. And the house itself changed too. The kitchen especially became a place of constant motion and irresistible smells. I can still see my mother rolling out dough for sugar cookies, her apron dusted with flour, Christmas music playing softly from the radio on the counter. The cookies came out of the oven golden and warm, covered in sprinkles of red and green sugar. Fruitcakes, yes, the real ones, dense and heavy with candied fruit, were wrapped in wax paper and hidden away to mature. Candy canes hung from the tree branches, though they rarely lasted more than a few days before disappearing into small, sticky hands. And there were always pies, cooling on the windowsill, pumpkin, pecan, apple, each one a promise of the feast to come. Christmas Eve was my favorite night of the entire year. The anticipation was electric, like the air before a snowfall. For many families, ours included, it meant bundling up and heading to the small white-steepled church down the road. Inside, the sanctuary glowed with candlelight. Wreaths of holly hung on every pew, and the choir's voices rose in hymns that seemed to reach straight to the stars. I remember how my breath would catch when we sang Silent Night by candlelight, the entire congregation swaying gently, faces illuminated by the soft, golden glow. Walking home afterward, the snow crunching underfoot and the stars glittering above, it felt as though the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for morning. Back at home, we'd set out cookies and a glass of milk for Santa, sometimes with a note scribbled in crooked handwriting asking him how the reindeer were doing. Our stockings, which in those days were often just our actual wool socks, were hung carefully on the mantel. Then came the hardest part of all, trying to fall asleep. My siblings and I would whisper across the room, certain we could hear hooves on the roof or a faint jingle of bells. Sleep always came eventually, but it was light and restless, shot through with dreams of wrapped packages and ribboned surprises. And then, oh, that morning, I swear there's no sound in the world quite like a child's feet hitting the stairs on Christmas morning. We'd race down before the sun even rose, stopping only when we were told to wait for Mom and Dad. The stockings came first. Oranges, candy canes, a few coins, maybe a small toy. Then the gifts under the tree, and though there were never mountains of them, each one felt enormous. A board game, a doll, a new sled with shining red paint. One year I got a model rocket kit, and I swear I didn't stop smiling for days. It wasn't about how much we got it. It was about the wonder of the moment, the sense that the world was overflowing with kindness. But what I remember most isn't the presents. It's the people. The house would fill with family, grandparents, cousins, neighbors who'd stop by just to share a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies. The table was set with care, every chair pulled up close, every dish steaming and fragrant. There was always a golden turkey or a glazed ham, mashed potatoes whipped to a cloud, stuffing rich with sage and onions, green bean casserole topped with the crispy onions. And dessert, pies, cookies, even a trifle some years, was never in short supply. Laughter filled every corner of the house. Stories were told and retold. The days seemed to stretch on forever, each hour sweeter than the last. As magical as Christmas morning always felt, the season never ended there. In many ways it only deepened, stretching into the long, slow, golden days between Christmas and New Year's, when school was out, families were together, and time itself seemed to move differently. Those were the days I remember most vividly. Lazy afternoons spent on the living room floor building train sets around the base of the tree, evenings when neighbors dropped by just to share stories, and nights when the glow from every house in the block seemed to linger a little longer, as if no one wanted the magic to fade. The world outside our windows looked like a postcard. I remember stepping out onto the porch in the crisp afternoon air, the snow crunching under my boots, the smoke from chimneys curling lazily into a pale blue sky. Kids raced sleds down the hill by the old schoolyard, their laughter carrying clear and bright across the cold. Others laced up skates and took to frozen ponds, spinning in clumsy circles or chasing pucks across the ice. We built forts and launched snowball battles that lasted until our mittens were soaked and our cheeks burned red. There was no rush to go anywhere. The world slowed down in winter, and we loved every second of it. Evenings were for visiting. It was an unspoken tradition back then. Families would walk across the street or around the block to spend an hour or two with friends and neighbors. We'd arrive bundled in coats and scarves, cheeks pink from the cold, bearing small gifts, a tin of cookies, a jar of homemade jam, a loaf of sweet bread. Inside, houses were warm and glowing, radios or hi-fis playing soft carols, fireplaces crackling. Adults sipped coffee or a bit of eggnog and traded stories about the year gone by, while we kids played board games in the corner or sprawled on the floor flipping through comic books we'd just unwrapped a few days earlier. There was something deeply comforting in that rhythm, a kind of closeness that didn't need an invitation, a reminder that the holidays were as much about people as they were about presents. Television became a bigger part of the season, too. By the early 1960s, most families had a TV, and many evenings were spent gathered in front of it, the glow from the screen mixing with the twinkle of the Christmas tree. I remember the annual holiday specials, variety shows hosted by Perry Como or Andy Williams, animated classics like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and A Charlie Brown Christmas, which quickly became traditions in their own right. Even the commercials felt special that time of year, with jingling sleigh bells, smiling Santas, and families gathered around dinner tables. The whole country seemed to be tuned in together, watching the same shows, laughing at the same jokes, humming the same songs. It was one of those rare moments when everyone felt connected, even if they'd never met. Music was everywhere, too. Our old record player spun endlessly through stacks of holiday albums. Bing Crosby, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, and the newer voices of the decade, too. The sounds of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas and Silver Bells floated through every room, as familiar and comforting as the smell of pine and cookies. And sometimes, if you were lucky, someone would sit down at the piano and start playing carols, and before long, the whole room would be singing. No one cared if the notes were off or the harmonies clumsy. It wasn't about perfection. It was about being together, about adding your own voice to a chorus that had been sung for generations. For children, those final days of the year were pure magic. Freed from school and homework, we filled every hour with small adventures, skating, sledding, building elaborate snow forts that sometimes lasted until March. If the weather was bad, we stayed indoors, building model airplanes or puzzles on the dining table, writing thank you notes for gifts, or just lying on the floor reading the books we'd received, and every so often we'd climb into the family car for a nighttime drive just to see the lights. There was nothing quite like it. Street after street of houses glowing against the dark, each one decorated differently, each one a small masterpiece of color and creativity. I used to press my forehead against the cold glass of the window and watch the lights blur as we drove past, feeling like the whole world was celebrating. New Year's Eve was different, less about wonder, more about reflection and hope. The adults usually hosted small gatherings at home. Tables were covered with platters of snacks, cheese balls, cocktails, sausages, bowls of mixed nuts, and little sandwiches. Someone always brought a punch bowl, often spiked a little more than we kids were supposed to know. Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett records played in the background, their smooth voices marking the end of one year and the start of another. Sometimes, if we were lucky, we were allowed to stay up late. I remember trying desperately to keep my eyes open, staring at the clock as it crept toward midnight, the grown-ups laughing and clinking glasses as the countdown began. And then, 10, 9, 8, the room would swell with excitement. At midnight, there were hugs and cheers, horns blasting, and the sound of Auld Lang Syne drifting from the radio. For a few moments, time itself seemed to stand still, and the whole world felt new again. Even New Year's Day had its own traditions. Most families started the morning with the Rose Parade on TV, floats covered in thousands of flowers rolling slowly through the streets of Pasadena. The kitchen filled with the smell of breakfast casseroles and cinnamon rolls, and the afternoon was reserved for college football. Games that fathers and sons watched together, shouting at the screen as mothers brought in trays of snacks. It was a quieter day, slower and more relaxed, a gentle landing after weeks of celebration. But it always carried a feeling of optimism, a sense that the coming year was full of possibility. Looking back now, I realize that so much of what made those holidays special had nothing to do with money or extravagance. Most of us didn't have much. Gifts were simple, often handmade. Decorations were reused year after year. Travel meant long car rides with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper or, if you were lucky, a train ride across snowy landscapes to visit grandparents. But none of that mattered. What mattered was how it felt. It was the warmth of a crowded living room, the glow of a tree reflected in a window pane, the sound of carols sung slightly off-key. It was the kindness of neighbors who shoveled each other's driveways, the joy of friends dropping by unannounced, the simple happiness of sitting by the fire with people you loved. I think about it often, how December in the 1960s wasn't just a month, but a mood. It was a season that lived inside you. It taught us patience, generosity, and gratitude. It reminded us that joy didn't need to be bought or wrapped. It was something you shared, something you built together. And even now, decades later, when the holidays roll around and the first strains of White Christmas drift through the air, I feel a spark of that old magic. I see the faces of the people I loved, hear the laughter echoing through rooms long gone, and I remember what it felt like to believe, truly believe, that the best days were still ahead. So if you ever find yourself longing for a simpler, warmer kind of Christmas, think back to that time. Remember the glow of the lights on a snowy night, the laughter of neighbors calling greetings across a fence, the thrill of a child's heart beating fast on Christmas Eve. Remember the promise of a new year stretching out like a blank page. That's what the holidays meant then, and in a way, that's what they still mean now. A chance to pause, to cherish, and to hope, because no matter how much the world changes, that feeling, that deep, quiet, enduring joy, never truly fades. It lives on in our memories, in our traditions, and in the stories we pass down. And those stories, they're exactly what I'm here to share. So if this little trip down memory lane warmed your heart even a little, I hope you'll stick around. On this channel, every single day, we dive into more stories just like this, about how people lived, loved, celebrated, and persevered in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and beyond. There's a whole world of forgotten traditions and timeless wisdom waiting to be rediscovered, and I'd be honored to share it with you. 'Cause sometimes looking back isn't about nostalgia. It's about carrying the best parts of the past with us as we step into the future. I sometimes close my eyes and I'm there again, walking down a snow-covered main street sometime in December 1974. The cold nipping gently at my cheeks, the smell of roasted chestnuts mixing with pine and peppermint, and the sound of distant Christmas carols floating on the crisp winter air. The 1970s were a time unlike any other, and nowhere was that magic felt more deeply than during the holidays. Christmas and New Year's back then weren't about speed or screens or online shopping. They were about ritual and rhythm, about anticipation that built slowly and beautifully from the day after Thanksgiving until the last piece of tinsel was taken down sometime in January. They were about togetherness, tradition, and a kind of joy that seemed to settle into every corner of our homes and hearts. Hello and welcome. You're watching Retro Days with David, a place where I share my passion for the past and celebrate the timeless stories, sounds, and spirit that shaped this country. From the golden age of classic cars to the unforgettable music and cultural milestones that define generations, this channel is dedicated to honoring those memories. If you're visiting for the first time, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of my upcoming journeys into America's rich and fascinating history. I was a teenager in those years, maybe 16 or 17, and I can still feel the electric excitement that filled the air as soon as December arrived. Everything seemed to change overnight. The hardware store downtown strung multicolored bulbs across its windows. The 5 and dime replaced its usual display with rows of toy trains, tin robots, and shiny red wagons. And every lamppost down Main Street was wrapped in garlands and lights, topped with glowing stars or bells that twinkled like they had been plucked straight from a storybook. There was a particular kind of magic to those holiday nights. The snow didn't just fall. It drifted lazily through the light of the street lamps, swirling gently in the wind like it had nowhere else to be. Storefronts glowed warm and golden against the cold, each one filled with holiday displays that seemed to compete for your imagination. Some were elaborate winter wonderlands with mechanical elves hammering away in toy workshops. Others were simple but charming. A few flickering candles, a nativity scene, or a Christmas tree heavy with silver tinsel and oversized glass ornaments that caught the light like jewels. We didn't rush from place to place the way people do now. We wandered, we lingered. My friends and I would spend hours walking downtown in the evenings, hands stuffed into mittened pockets, pausing to press our noses to frosted shop windows. We'd talk about what we hoped to find under the tree that year. Maybe a new record player, a leather-bound journal, or the latest Polaroid camera. But deep down, we knew the gifts were only part of the story. What really mattered was the feeling, the laughter, the warmth, the sense that for a few weeks the whole world slowed down and leaned into joy. And oh, the decorations. Christmas in the 70s had a style all its own. A glorious mix of old-fashioned charm and space-age optimism. Houses glowed with strings of oversized C9 bulbs in red, green, blue, and orange, the kind that gave off just a hint of warmth you could feel on your hand if you held it close. Aluminum trees, popular earlier in the decade, stood proudly in living rooms, their shiny silver branches reflecting the colorful glow of rotating light wheels that painted them in shifting hues of blue, green, and red. And tinsel, so much tinsel, draped over every branch, catching the glow of Christmas lights and making the whole tree shimmer like freshly fallen snow. There was something comforting about how homemade everything felt. Sure, you could buy decorations in stores, but many of us made our own. Paper snowflakes taped to windows, construction paper chains stretching across mantels, popcorn and cranberry garlands strung carefully on sewing thread, all crafted by hand during cozy family evenings, while holiday specials played softly on the television. Every ornament seemed to carry a story. The little wooden soldier my father carved one year, the glass angel my mother had since she was a girl, the glitter-covered pine cone I made in kindergarten and insisted on hanging front and center every single year. Speaking of television, nothing set the mood for the season quite like it. We didn't have hundreds of channels or streaming platforms, but we didn't need them. Each December brought a handful of specials that everyone watched together. A Charlie Brown Christmas reminded us that the holiday was about more than commercialism. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman filled living rooms with laughter and music. And when It's a Wonderful Life came on, usually just a few days before Christmas Eve, families gathered in silence, passing around mugs of cocoa and letting the warmth of that black and white story wash over them like a familiar carol. Music was everywhere too, not just background noise, but a vital part of the season. Radios hummed with classics from Bing Crosby, Perry Como, and Andy Williams, while newer hits from the Carpenters or John Denver slipped into the rotation. Vinyl records spun on console stereos, filling living rooms with the sounds of sleigh bells, choirs, and orchestras. I can still hear the gentle crackle of a record needle settling into the groove before the first notes of "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" floated through the house. There was no playlist, no algorithm, just a collection of songs passed down through generations, each one tied to 1,000 memories. And then, of course, there was shopping, a holiday tradition in its own right. Forget the frantic online carts and 2-day shipping of today. Back then, Christmas shopping was an event, a ritual you looked forward to all year. Department stores like Sears, Montgomery Ward, and J.C. Penney transformed into magical wonderlands, their aisles lined with toys, gadgets, clothes, and holiday treats. The annual Sears Wish Book catalog was practically sacred. Hundreds of glossy pages filled with treasures to dream about. My siblings and I would spend hours poring over it, circling toys and arguing over which one Santa was most likely to bring. Shopping trips downtown were a family affair. We'd bundle up in scarves and heavy coats, drive through the snow in our station wagon, and spend the whole afternoon wandering from store to store. Bells jingled cheerfully above every doorway, and the smell of cinnamon and pine seemed to follow us wherever we went. Afterward, we'd stop for hot chocolate at Woolworth's lunch counter, our cheeks flushed from the cold, our arms loaded with carefully wrapped packages. There was no rush, no stress, just the joy of choosing gifts with love and imagining the smiles they'd bring on Christmas morning. By mid-December, the season was in full swing. School let out for winter break, and those 2 weeks felt like pure freedom. We'd spend afternoons sledding down neighborhood hills until our fingers were numb, then come home to steaming mugs of cocoa and the smell of cookies baking in the oven. Evenings were reserved for decorating, wrapping gifts, or visiting neighbors to deliver tins of homemade fudge and peppermint bark. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there was light. Strings of bulbs draped from porches, glowing plastic Santas stood watch on lawns, and every window seemed to frame a Christmas tree twinkling like a beacon in the night. Christmas Eve was always the most magical night of the year. The house would be spotless, the tree glowing softly in the corner, and the kitchen alive with the smells of roasting turkey and spiced cider. Relatives would begin to arrive just after dusk. Uncles with boom and laughter, aunts carrying casseroles, cousins bundled in winter coats and scarves. The house would fill with noise and warmth, the clink of dishes, the pop of champagne corks, and the sound of familiar stories told for the 100th time. After dinner, we'd gather in the living room for what felt like the heart of the season, exchanging gifts, not the biggest or most expensive, but the most thoughtful. A handmade scarf, a favorite book, a photo album filled with memories, and always, always the stockings, each one filled with little surprises, chocolate coins wrapped in gold foil, candy canes, tiny toys, and maybe a few crisp dollar bills folded neatly at the bottom. Then, as the night grew late and the younger kids grew sleepy, we'd read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" by the glow of the tree lights, the words as familiar and comforting as the warmth of the fire. Christmas morning was a symphony of joy. The sky outside might still be dark when we woke, but the house felt alive. The smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls wafted from the kitchen. Wrapping paper rustled and tore as children shouted with delight over new bikes, dolls, and board games. Parents smiled over practical gifts, a new robe, a set of tools, maybe a pair of leather gloves. The television played a loop of holiday music, and somewhere in the distance church bells rang, their sound floating softly on the cold morning air. The rest of the day was a blur of happiness, phone calls to relatives far away, long walks through snowy neighborhoods, and an endless feast that seemed to last from noon until night. And through it all, there was laughter, deep, genuine laughter, the kind that bubbles up from the heart and fills a room with warmth. It was the sound of family, of friendship, of love. New Year's had a magic of its own. While Christmas was about tradition and home, New Year's Eve was about possibility, the promise of a blank slate, a fresh start, a whole new year stretching out before you. We'd gather with friends or neighbors, crowding into living rooms decorated with silver streamers and balloons. There was always music, maybe Elton John or Fleetwood Mac spinning on the turntable, and plenty of food, cheese balls, cocktail sausages, deviled eggs, and punch bowls filled with sparkling cider. Televisions were tuned to Guy Lombardo or Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve, and as the clock crept toward midnight, excitement built like a drum roll. We'd count down to final seconds together. 10, 9, 8. Voices growing louder with each number until the room exploded with cheers and laughter at the stroke of 12. Balloons dropped, champagne corks popped, and hugs were exchanged all around. Outside, fireworks lit up the winter sky, their reflections dancing in the snow, and for a few perfect moments, everything felt possible. January 1st was a quieter day, but no less special. We'd sleep in late, then gather for a big family breakfast, pancakes, bacon, and fresh squeezed orange juice, before settling in to watch the Rose Parade on TV, the floats, the marching bands, the endless stream of color and pageantry. It was the perfect way to start a new year. And as the day faded into evening and the last of the holiday decorations began to come down, there was always a bittersweet feeling. The season was ending, but the memories, the laughter, the warmth, the love would linger long after the last ornament was packed away. Looking back now, I realize that what made those holidays so special wasn't the gifts or the decorations or even the food. It was the time spent together, time spent slowing down, time spent savoring the simple joys of the season. It was a different pace of life, one that felt richer and deeper precisely because it wasn't rushed. And though the world has changed, and changed dramatically, since those days, the heart of the holidays remains the same. It's still about love and laughter, about family and friendship, about hope and new beginnings. Today, the lights are brighter, the music louder, and the ways we celebrate more varied than ever. We can video call loved ones from thousands of miles away. We can order gifts from around the world with a few taps on a screen. We can stream endless holiday movies and create playlists that last for days. And all of that is wonderful, truly. But sometimes I still find myself longing for the quiet magic of those 1970s Christmases and New Years, for the way snow looked under the glow of colored lights, for the taste of cocoa after an afternoon of sledding, for the sound of my family's laughter echoing through a house filled with love. Because that's what the holidays really are. Not a date on a calendar, not a list of traditions, but a feeling. And that feeling, that deep, glowing warmth that starts in your chest and spreads through every part of you, is timeless. It's the same now as it was then. And every December, when the first carols start to play and the first snow begins to fall, I close my eyes and I'm back there once more, a teenager in the 1970s, standing under twinkling lights, dreaming of the future, and knowing beyond a doubt that the best is yet to come. Thank you for spending this time with me and taking a step back into the world of retro America. If you enjoyed revisiting the moments, eras, and stories that helped shape our lives, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and turning on notifications. There's so much more to explore together. And I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Which decade holds the fondest memories for you? The classic 50s, the transformative 60s, or the bold and changing 70s? Your stories and reflections mean a lot